Rosa Ellis, an older janitor with a quiet strength, entered the courtroom on a mission she had carried with her for years, to expose the truth about a powerful white judge, James Carter, whose reputation was built on prejudice rather than justice. Rosa wasn't there to clean. Not really. Her worn notebook and old ID badge were tucked away, hidden under the guise of a simple janitor's uniform. She had been preparing for this day for weeks, gathering information, piecing together the patterns of racial bias she knew were present in the courtroom. The sun had barely risen over the Georgia town as she stood in her modest motel room, alone with her thoughts. Her mind was sharp, her focus unshakable, and as she held the phone to her ear, she spoke with calm assurance to her contact. "I'll go in today, just as planned. No attention, just observation," she said, her voice steady, revealing nothing of the fire that burned within her. Rosa knew this day was crucial, not just for the case at hand, but for the many others that had gone unnoticed, for the injustices that had been ignored. As she walked into the courthouse, her mock cart rolling behind her, no one gave her a second glance. To them, she was invisible. To them, she was just another cleaning woman in the background, a part of the scenery. But Rosa had always known that people who were deemed invisible often saw everything. The courthouse smelled of lemon cleaner and old papers. The tiles echoed under her shoes. And Rosa made her way to the courtroom. She wasn't just here to observe. She was here to uncover the truth. As the morning unfolded, the tension in the room was palpable. The young black man sitting at the defense table, Jalen Thomas, was clearly out of place in a courtroom that had long been stacked against people like him. The weight of racial bias was heavy in the air. And Rosa, standing near the back, watched every move, every word. She observed the way Judge Carter leaned forward when the prosecution spoke, and the way he dismissed the defense with a flick of his hand. She took note of the subtle but telling signs, the way the system, with all its authority, would turn a blind eye to the truth. Rosa knew that this was not just one trial. It was a pattern, a deeply ingrained flaw in the very system that was supposed to protect people. And Rosa, in her quiet, unassuming way, was there to make sure that pattern would no longer go unchallenged. The world may not have noticed her yet, but Rosa Ellis was no ordinary janitor. She was a force of justice. And today, she was ready to bring the truth to light. Rosa Ellis stood in the courtroom, her quiet presence unnoticed by most. But her mind was sharp and unwavering. For weeks, she had observed the patterns of injustice. The way Judge Carter dismissed the rights of the marginalized, especially black defendants like Jalen Thomas. He was just a young man, barely 22, facing serious charges that were based on flimsy evidence. But in this courtroom, facts didn't matter. What mattered was power, power that Judge Carter wielded with arrogance, dismissing objections with ease and cutting off any voice that dared to question him. Rosa had seen it all before. She had seen how Carter's bias showed in the way he ruled, in the way he treated the defense, in the way his words were sharp and cold when it came to the black defendants in his court. She had heard the stories, the whispers in the halls, the murmurs from those who had tried to speak out before and been silenced. Rosa wasn't just a janitor. She wasn't just someone who cleaned the floors and emptied the trash. She was a witness to the truth, a truth that had been ignored for far too long. As Rosa watched the proceedings unfold, her mind raced. She took note of every inconsistency, every sign that this was not a fair trial. The defense attorney, Marcus Reed, was young, inexperienced, and clearly out of his depth in front of a judge who had long made up his mind. Rosa saw it in the way the prosecution was allowed to speak freely, while the defense struggled to get a word in. She noted how Carter leaned forward, eager to hear the prosecution's every word, but barely gave the defense the time of day. The tension in the room grew thick as the trial continued. But Rosa remained calm. She wasn't there to make a scene. She was there to observe, to document, to gather the evidence that would finally expose the truth. She knew that what she was witnessing wasn't just a flawed trial, it was a system broken at its core. The power, the bias, the disregard for fairness, It all came from the man sitting behind the bench. Judge Carter. Rosa had no intention of letting this pass unnoticed. She was going to make sure that the truth was heard, no matter what. It wasn't about the case at hand anymore. It was about something much bigger. It was about standing up to the system, about challenging the injustice that had been allowed to fester for far too long. Rosa Ellis had seen enough. She was ready to take action. The world might not have known her name yet, but today, that was about to change. She was no longer just a silent observer. Today, she was going to make her voice heard, and nothing would stop her. Rosa Ellis knew that the time had come to confront the truth she had been quietly gathering for so long. As she continued her work, pushing her mop cart through the courthouse halls, she overheard a conversation that confirmed everything she had feared. The voices of Judge Carter and District Attorney Henry Blake echoed down the hallway, filled with contempt and casual racism. Rosa froze, every word sinking into her like a heavy weight. "These kids," Carter sneered, "they think they can walk in here, cry race, and get away with it. Back in my day, they wouldn't dare talk back to a judge." His words were cold, dripping with disdain, and Rosa felt the sting of every sentence. Blake's response, equally dismissive, made it clear that they both shared a dangerous belief that the system was theirs to control, and those who didn't fit their mold were expendable. Rosa's grip on her mop tightened, her heart racing. She had heard enough. The truth that had been whispered about Carter, the bias, the disregard for justice, wasn't just speculation. It was real, raw, and unfiltered. She could feel the anger rising within her, but she stayed still, keeping her composure. It was then that Carter stepped out of his office, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Rosa. His tone was menacing, and he demanded to know how long she had been listening. Rosa remained calm, her voice steady as she answered, "Just cleaning, sir, that's all." She didn't flinch, didn't let him see the storm of emotions brewing inside her. But something had shifted. Carter no longer saw her as just a janitor. He saw her as a threat. A quiet, invisible woman had become something far more dangerous to him. As he tried to intimidate her, Rosa knew this was the moment. She had come here for a reason, and now she had the proof she needed. Carter thought he could dismiss her. He thought she didn't matter. But Rosa Ellis had never been invisible. She had been watching, listening, and now she would act. She would no longer allow this man, or anyone like him, to wield power over those who had no voice. Rosa's silence was louder than any threat he could make. She turned away, her grip on her mop handle steady, her resolve stronger than ever. She had seen the truth, and now, it was time for that truth to be known. As the trial continued, the weight of injustice pressed heavily on Rosa's chest. She had witnessed the way Judge Carter dismissed the defense, the way he had already decided the fate of Jalen Thomas before any evidence was even truly considered. The young man, barely 22, sat at the defense table, a picture of both fear and dignity. The room was thick with tension, but Carter was too arrogant to notice. He ruled with an iron fist, making judgment calls without a second thought, cutting off the defense at every turn, dismissing objections as if they were nothing. Rosa's eyes never left him. She watched his every movement, noting the subtle shifts in his demeanor as the trial progressed. But this wasn't just about the trial anymore. Rosa was no longer simply observing. She was feeling the weight of everything she had seen, the anger and the injustice of it all bubbling inside her. Rosa knew that what was happening in that courtroom was a reflection of something far greater, something that had plagued the system for years. The biases that Judge Carter had shown were not isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern, a dangerous and entrenched system that had been allowed to continue unchecked. As the prosecution pushed forward, the room seemed to close in around Rosa. Every word spoken, every decision made, felt like another nail in the coffin for justice. But Rosa wasn't ready to let it end this way. She wasn't just there to witness the downfall of a young man. She was there to bring about change. She had seen too much, understood too much, to remain silent. It was during a brief recess that Rosa stood in the hallway, her mop cart abandoned for a moment as she silently steeled herself for what was to come. The voices of Carter and Blake echoed in her mind. The contempt and the hatred that had been so freely spoken now driving her to take action. When Carter confronted her, his cold words were meant to intimidate, to remind her of her place. But Rosa wasn't afraid. She had already seen through him. She had seen the truth. And now, it was time for that truth to be revealed. With quiet resolve, she gathered the strength to stand up and speak, no longer invisible. No longer silent. This was her moment, and nothing would stop her from making the truth known. The tension in the courtroom reached its peak as Judge Carter made his final ruling. Ready to sentence Jalen Thomas without a second thought. Without the fairness the law demanded. But Rosa Ellis, who had been quietly watching from the back, was no longer a mere observer. She had been gathering evidence, documenting the injustice, and silently watching the man who thought he could control the courtroom with his arrogance and prejudice. Carter, with his reputation built on years of bias and disdain for defendants of color, was ready to close the case. But Rosa was determined to rewrite the ending. With calm but unshakable determination, she walked forward, leaving behind her mock cart, her work gloves tucked inside. She was no longer invisible. As she stepped forward, the room grew still, eyes following her every move. Judge Carter, taken aback by her unexpected boldness, scoffed at her. He mocked her, assuming that she, a janitor, had no place in a courtroom, let alone the authority to speak. But Rosa had been preparing for this moment. With quiet confidence, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a leather badge holder. She opened it slowly, the seal of the United States Supreme Court gleaming for all to see. The room fell silent in disbelief as Rosa revealed who she truly was, an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. Sent undercover at the request of the Department of Justice to investigate the racial bias and misconduct of Judge Carter. Her voice rang out clearly and with undeniable authority. She spoke not with anger, but with the calm assurance of someone who had seen enough, who had gathered the truth and was ready to share it with the world. Rosa outlined the pattern of bias, the abuse of authority, and the disregard for due process that had marked Carter's rulings. She revealed how he had consistently dismissed objections, ignored evidence, and ruled in favor of the prosecution, especially when the defendant was black or Latino. Carter, now pale and visibly shaken, tried to dismiss her words, calling it a political attack. But Rosa was steadfast. Her words cut through his defense like a blade, sharper than any argument. "This isn't politics, Judge," she said, "it's accountability." In that moment, Rosa Ellis, once invisible, had become the embodiment of justice. She had not just stood up for the truth, she had made it undeniable. The room, once filled with the oppressive weight of injustice, now felt lighter as the truth came to light. Rosa didn't need applause. She didn't need victory. What mattered was that the truth had been spoken, and nothing could silence it now. The case was dismissed. Jalen was freed, and Rosa, with quiet dignity, walked out of the courtroom, knowing she had done what needed to be done. The courtroom, once charged with tension and disbelief, had fallen into an almost reverent silence as the truth Rosa Ellis had revealed sank in. With her unyielding composure and undeniable authority, she had exposed the dark reality of Judge Carter's misconduct, the racial bias that had shaped his decisions for years. The case against Jalen Thomas was dismissed, and the charges were dropped. Justice had been served, not in the way anyone had expected, but in the way it had always been meant to unfold. Jalen, still stunned by the turn of events, sat motionless at the defense table, his eyes wide with confusion and disbelief. He hadn't fully grasped what had just happened, but the relief was unmistakable. Rosa's gaze met his, and in that brief moment, words weren't needed. His gratitude, his hope, and his sheer amazement were written across his face. It wasn't just about one man's case, it was about so much more. Rosa had come here not for headlines, not for recognition, but for him and for the countless others who had been denied their voices. She had stepped into that courtroom as a janitor, invisible to all, but what she had revealed was something no one could ignore. The system had been broken, and she had been the one to fix it. But Rosa didn't stay for the applause or the admiration that followed. She didn't need it. What mattered to her was that justice had been served, that the truth had finally seen the light of day. As she walked toward the exit, her mop cart left behind in the corner, she knew that the path she had chosen was never going to be easy. But it was the right one. People moved aside as she passed, not because they were told to, but because they understood. They understood that Rosa Ellis had made them see the truth, had made them feel the weight of justice in a way they never had before. The world would remember this moment, not because of her, but because of what she had made them see. And as Rosa stepped out of the courtroom and into the sunlight, she knew that, for once, the system had worked the way it was meant to. She had done what needed to be done, not for glory, but for the greater good. Justice, she knew, could never truly be silenced. And sometimes, it just needed the right person to give it a voice. The silence in the courtroom was heavy as Rosa Ellis walked out, leaving behind the mop cart that had once defined her role as invisible. She had never expected recognition, never wanted to be seen. But today, everything had changed. As she moved through the aisles, the eyes of the people in the room followed her, not with the casual indifference they had once shown, but with a newfound respect and understanding. Rosa's actions had shaken the foundation of the courthouse, and now, they saw her for what she truly was, a force of justice. Unwavering and resolute. She hadn't come here for applause. She hadn't come here to be a hero. She had come for the truth. And that was all that mattered. The weight of her decision, of the words she had spoken, settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water. People were no longer looking at her as the janitor, the quiet woman who cleaned the floors. They were looking at her as someone who had stood up when it mattered most. Rosa's small, deliberate steps carried the weight of an entire system being forced to face its truth. She had uncovered the corruption, the bias, and the disregard for justice that had existed for far too long. And in doing so, she had not just changed Jalen Thomas's life, but had altered the course of the system that had failed him and countless others like him. As Rosa exited the courtroom, the sun bathed her in light. But it wasn't the light of victory, it was the light of truth. A truth that would not be buried again. She hadn't been searching for recognition, but she had earned something far more important. The quiet, profound respect of everyone who had witnessed her courage. The world had seen what she was capable of, and for once, they knew that the truth could no longer be ignored. Rosa didn't need the world to praise her. She needed the world to see, and they had. As she walked away from the courthouse, she knew that her job wasn't done. There would be more injustices to uncover, more battles to fight. But today, Rosa Ellis had made a difference. She had given a voice to those who had none, and in doing so, she had reminded the world of the most powerful force there is: truth.